Okay, so in this video, we're gonna talk about protagonists. Now, I'm gonna use my protagonist in the novel Rage Monster as an example. Now, before we begin, if you want to support this channel, you can buy my books on Amazon. But let's get to it. Right? The importance of the protagonist cannot be underestimated. I'm going to use my protagonist, Hux Moloch, from the novel Rage Monster, as an example. Because, okay, this video is advice for aspiring writers. Because I believe that even, in some cases, even veteran, experienced writers, novelists, they do not understand that the protagonist is even more important. He is or she is the most important aspect of any book. And even experienced writers don't understand this for some reason. And you can clearly tell from their books that they do not consider their protagonist to be of the utmost importance. The protagonist is number one, and then number two, you have the story, the narrative, right? The protagonist is, first and foremost, the moral compass of the reader. And why that is, it is because the reader has to identify with the protagonist, has to. You know, every time I read a book, automatically I look toward the protagonist. What is he or she about? What's going on? Etc. The protagonist is Polaris. You are attracted to the protagonist first and foremost, right? And that is why you, as an aspiring writer, you have to put in your all. You have to put in that work. You have to be extremely attentive to the protagonist. Your protagonist cannot be a cookie cutter, cardboard cutout, right? Because if your protagonist is trash, then perhaps, even if the story is good, the book might fail miserably. Because, I have to say this again, I'll repeat myself, the reader has to identify, the reader identifies with the protagonist. If the protagonist is lukewarm, subpar, then we're not going to be that invested in your story, right? Because we immerse ourselves as readers and we put ourselves in the shoes of the protagonist. That is how reading works. I don't know if it is conscious or subconscious, but that is just how it is, right? We put ourselves in the shoes of the protagonist. It is what it is. And that is why my advice to you as aspiring writers is never slack off when it comes to your protagonist. Everything else is number two. Your protagonist is of the utmost importance, and this cannot be denied one way or another, right? The best stories out there are way more enhanced when they have a protagonist that is on that level, on that caliber, right? There are certain protagonists, a handful, that are in a league of their own. And that is why those stories, those books, those movies, those TV shows are legendary. It is because of the protagonist. And let me say this, the protagonist can be a piece of shit, right? The protagonist can be a villain. It doesn't matter. Because we're going to find some way to relate to that person, no matter how evil he or she is. When it comes to my book, right, the protagonist is Hux Moloch. He is, by the end, a terrible person, right? A completely evil person that is too far gone. You cannot redeem him, and you cannot forgive what he has done, but I've written him in a certain way that even though you as a reader by the end cannot forgive all of the horrible things that he has done, you still kind of feel bad for him. You still kind of like him in a way. You still kind of, you see, those are the best characters. You know, I'm not trying to brag or anything, but those are the best characters that even if they do completely heinous things, they're written in a certain way that they're still sympathetic somehow, right? And it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of effort to create a protagonist that is up to speed, that is on a level beyond, cookie cutter. Because we immerse ourselves in the protagonist's shoes, the writer has to write the protagonist in such a way to spark something in the reader, because we automatically relate to the protagonist. Therefore, as readers, this protagonist has to spark something in us, right? No matter what happens in the book, the protagonist has to stir something in us. Even if it doesn't matter if it is positive or negative, right? It always has to be about the protagonist in the end, because yet again, because we immerse ourselves, the protagonist is like a friend. The protagonist is like an ally, or even the protagonist, we become the protagonist in some cases, depending on the immersion, right? So every time the protagonist is on the page, he or she has to leave an impression, you know, because it is an intimate relationship, an intimate, private action reading about these characters. It is extremely intimate, right? We form a relationship with this protagonist. And because we feel these strong emotions toward the protagonist, that is why the narrative, the story of this book will flow easily, even if it has certain defects, right? It doesn't matter because the protagonist is top level and we follow this protagonist no matter how the narrative flows, right? Be very, very careful how you write your protagonists. Make sure that your protagonists aren't cringe. Make sure that your protagonists are the best that they could be in every shape and in every way possible. Because I've written this, this colossus of a book, right? Because I've written this colossus of a book, now I can look back on it and just see how this protagonist evolved from, you know, some guy, right, that you kind of felt bad for, to this complete monster that just destroyed everything. But even at the end, you can still kind of make excuses for him. You can still feel bad for what happens to him, even though his actions, his crimes are unforgivable, right? And those are the best protagonists, those that leave an impact on the reader, right? One reason why we read is because we connect with these fictitious characters. We want to be like them, we want to be their friends, etc. And that is why your protagonist has to be on another level, because though you do not want to have a disappointed reader on your hands. That is the worst thing that it can happen to your reader, right? Imagine reading a novel and by the end you just feel disappointed in the protagonist, in the story, And it happens, right? It happens. But your job, your mission as a writer, as a novelist, is to be careful, put in that work, don't slack off, be attentive, and write the best character that you can write. Because listen, here's another secret. If you put in that time in your protagonist, if you focus and concentrate and don't slack off when it comes to your protagonist, the story will flow easily. You'll be able to write the story well and fast because you have something to work with now. You have a protagonist that you want to write about. See, that's how it works. If you care about your protagonist, if if this protagonist stirs something in you as the writer, then the story will flow easily. Because you want to write about this character. You want to find out more about this character, so you have to write, right? And you will not have a serious problem with the story if you have a developed protagonist. That's just how it is. In my experience, that is what happens if you like and you love your protagonist. If your protagonist is developed, then the story will come by itself almost. Listen, the protagonist, whether you like it or not, carries the book, carries the story, carries the TV show, the movie, or whatever. Okay? It is what it is. The protagonist is a sort of mascot. The protagonist is the sun in the center, and everything else orbits around the protagonist. It is what it is. That's how stories work. That is why I emphasize so much and on you developing your protagonist. I know you have an amazing story in your head, but without a decent protagonist, at least decent, this amazing story of yours will fall flat on its feet. It is what it is, okay? I've published 2 books. I've read a decent amount of books. This is the wisdom, the knowledge that I have to impart on you. When it comes to my protagonist, Hux Malak, I really believe that I've written him in such a way for him to be a bit unique. Ergo, if nothing else will titillate you while reading this book, I'm very sure that at least he, the protagonist, will stir something in you. It is my belief. I'm confident in this, right? If everything else in this book bores you, that I am confident when I say that at least the protagonist will leave an impression on you. And that is not an easy brag or boast to make. For the reader, the protagonist is almost like a friend by the end of the book. It is what it is. So by the end of the book, and while you read, the fate of the protagonist is your number one concern. By this point, the protagonist has become a sort of friend, ally, etc. to the reader. It is what it is. This is how reading works. We cannot help ourselves but somehow relate to this protagonist. Right? The protagonist is that important ingredient that keeps the reader hooked. Right? Everything else is beneath the protagonist. You as a reader has to understand this. Number one is the protagonist, and then the story and all the other characters. Right? Without a decent protagonist, the story will always fall flat on its feet, because no matter how amazing the story is, if you have a dull, stale, mediocre protagonist, then you do not care what happens to him or her. I don't care how amazing the story is. If your protagonist isn't up to speed, up to par, then the reader will not care about this story. The reader will not care how it affects the protagonist. Because if you do not feel anything toward the protagonist, then maybe the reader will stop reading, and that is not something you want to happen as a writer. So in my case, in my book, what I did was I created chapter by chapter this idea of who the protagonist is. But every so often, I had to destroy every expectation. I had to aggrandize, I had to escalate, I had to aggravate, I had to push the envelope to the extreme and then some, and then go beyond that in terms of who the protagonist is. That was my mantra when it came to this protagonist, Hux Malak, right? Because it happens quite often that a writer, after a certain amount of time, the writer gets a bit too familiar with the protagonist, and because the writer gets so familiar with the protagonist, then the protagonist will not develop anymore because the writer is too familiar with this protagonist, right? You never have to be, you should never become too familiar. You should always find another unknown aspect of your protagonist. There always has to be something else, just a there always has to be something else just around the corner when it comes to your protagonist, right? Do not ever believe that you have discovered everything about your protagonist, that there is nothing else possibly that you could write new about this protagonist. Never assume that your job is done when it comes to the protagonist. Always go beyond the extremes, and then beyond those extremes, there will never be an apex. Okay? There will never be an apex. You always have to go beyond. Push the envelope. Push the extremes. Go beyond what you know. Right? Because that is what makes for an interesting protagonist. You always have to discover something else, something new about this protagonist. And this is important. You might discover something about the protagonist that you do not like, a negative aspect, right? This shows that your protagonist isn't, one-dimensional or a goody two-shoes or a Mary Sue, right? Your protagonist has to be fleshed out, has to look like a real person. You have to be realistic as a writer and make these protagonists seem like real people, warts and all. Your protagonist cannot be this goody two-shoes. Let's all be friends. I'm gonna forgive everybody. Friendship, the power of friendship, and we're all together. Nothing bad can happen to us. No, no. Oh, see, that's subpar, mediocre writing. That's boring. All right. Flesh these characters out, make them seem realistic, make them seem human with flaws and defects, right? And negative, dark aspects, right? Because now, since you have your reader invested in this protagonist, the reader will be shocked to discover that, holy shit, this protagonist that I have followed, that I love, this protagonist isn't that good, or this protagonist made a choice that I would never make. I'm a bit concerned, right? This is how your reader should feel. Your reader should be shocked. Your reader should be concerned, confused, disoriented, right? And so on. The choices that your protagonist makes might not be the right ones, right? The choices that your protagonist makes might be in stark contrast to what the decisions of the reader might be, okay? You have to create this illusion that your reader and your protagonist are one and the same, that they are good people, that they can vibe, they can get along, and then you have to shatter this illusion with being a realistic writer, writing your protagonists in such a way that will inform the reader that this protagonist is an individual, a human being, and that this protagonist can make terrible mistakes. Terrible mistakes. Maybe intentionally. We don't know. To all you young, aspiring writers, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for you to have a tremendous protagonist. This should be your first order of business. This is how I began writing my book. I thought about the protagonist and everything else came after him, right? The story, all the other characters, they followed him because he is the center and everything else orbits around him. That's how it should be. You have to have an established protagonist. If you don't have an established protagonist, if you have a larger cast of would-be protagonists, it doesn't really work. The reader has to target one character, and that character has to be the protagonist, right? Because the reader has to relate to the protagonist at all costs, right? Because we as readers identify with the protagonist, right? And because we identify with the protagonist, we follow this character, we watch them grow up, we watch them make terrible decisions, and so forth. For example, my protagonist, Hux Malak, in this book, he is not a good person. He deliberately, intentionally chooses to be evil. He even says it, I do bad things because I like them. I like doing bad things. And he makes no apologies for it. But even though, and I'm not trying to brag, but even though he is a terrible person, I've written him in such a way that even the most judgmental reader might find something to relate to this protagonist, to sympathize, to empathize, right? And I think those are the best characters that you can write, that even though they might do bad things, right? This is a simplistic view, right? But even if they do bad things, they are written in such a way that you kind of feel bad for them. You just want to tell them that everything is going to be all right, but you can't because they're still pieces of shit, and so on, right? You want to be their friends, but they've made certain choices and certain decisions that you do not agree with, that you hate, but you still kind of like them, right? These are the kind of characters that you should think about writing, because anything less is milquetoast, subpar, banal, boring. Okay, never be boring, never be mediocre, right? The story will follow the protagonist. The protagonist should never follow the story. That's about it, okay? If you like what I do, if you like my channel, if you like my videos, if you want to support your boy, you can hop up to Amazon and buy my books and have yourself a good read, right? Because if there's anything that I can brag about is that I've written a book that is not average, right? Characters that are not average. At least the protagonist is not average, right? Thanks for watching. See ya!